Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Geo session. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined this week by Dr. Alasdair Pinkerton from Royal Holloway University, London. Alasdair is going to be talking today about geopolitics and putting the geo in geopolitics and why that matters. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we do get started. So this presentation and stream will be available after we've finished on the Geo website. You just got to go to the past events section on the website, and you can see the full playback there. So if you do miss half of it, or you'd like to share it with students or colleagues, you can do so there very easily. And we'll also put the PowerPoint up as well, so you can download that and reference it whenever you would like. If you would like to participate in any future lectures that we're doing, you can find all those in the live events section again on the Geo website. In terms of questions and comments, you can ask any questions or post any comments in the box on the right hand side. Alasdair might take them as we go through, or if not, I can ask them to him at the end. So do feel free to get involved there. Other than that, I think that's probably everything I need to say. So I will hand over to Alasdair, and you can get cracking.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That's a really nice introduction. And hello, everybody. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me, and hopefully you'll be able to see these slides as I go through the next 30 to 40 minutes. What I want to talk to you today about is the subject of geopolitics and where the geo and politics comes from, and ultimately why we should care about the subject of geopolitics. So I teach geopolitics at Royal Holloway, University of London. I teach my first years, a kind of basic introduction to it. I teach my third years, a far more specialist course. But I think one of the things that I have certainly noticed over the past 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years since I started teaching here at Royal Holloway, it's just the proliferation of the use of the term geopolitics in everyday society. Let me move on to my first slide. Geopolitics is everywhere. We seem to be living in a world crammed full of geopolitics. Particular terms are used, of course, that indicate to us that we're talking geopolitically. Maps, globes, borders, themes like globalization, of course. With discussions about the planet as kind of one system. Our attention is also drawn to particular places of geopolitical interest, continents like Asia, countries like Russia, China, rising powers, for example, in Africa. Also to alternative geopolitical themes, such as climate change and the environment. We are living in an increasingly interesting, contested, disputed geopolitical world. I'm sure some of the words that you can see on this word cloud are deeply familiar to you. And in particular, geopolitics as a particular term seems to be invading the pages of our newspapers, of popular magazines, of news sites. So here's just a sample from the last kind of 4 weeks or so. ABC News talking about Australia and the geopolitics of the space race, the conversation talking about TikTok, magazines, academic magazines like Nature talking about scientific collaboration and geopolitics. Some of you may even read the Geographical magazine and will, of course, be all too familiar with the fact that there's a geopolitics hotspot in there, the writer of which has recently changed. But geopolitics seems to be bombarding us through the pages of our news and drawing our attention to different places, different themes, different concepts, different technologies, different kinds of meeting points of geopolitical actors. Geopolitics, as I say, is everywhere. And it's also becoming a big business. So if you are interested in a career in banking or investment services, for example, you might very well be considering a career in geopolitical risk analysis. Here at the bottom left of this slide, you can see a page from the BlackRock Investment House website, where you can see geopolitical risk dashboard, for example. Think tanks are engaged in paid research, contributing ideas to government, to companies, auditing geopolitical capabilities, such as here the Henry Jackson Society. People are mapping out the geopolitics of the coronavirus. There are no shortage of podcasts and other online services teaching you, telling you about why you need to take geopolitics seriously. So geopolitics has become a big business. And it's become a big business too in terms of the production of popular books and texts about geopolitics. Here you've got Robert Kaplan's The Revenge of Geography, and on the left-hand side here, 2 books by Tim Marshall. And I know that many of you will have come across Tim Marshall's books. I know this because I often read personal statements from students applying to Royal Holloway who tell me that prisoners of geography have opened their eyes to the world of political geography and geopolitical thinking. So there you've got Prisoners of Geography and then the sequel, more recently, The Power of Geography. And in these books, we begin to develop an understanding of what some people consider geopolitics to be. And I want to just dive into one of the examples that Tim Marshall uses to try and set up for us what geopolitics actually means. So one of the parts of the world that Tim Marshall is particularly interested in is Europe and that transition point from Europe into Asia. So this isn't one of the maps from his book. I don't have permission to use that, but here is another topographical map, a relief map of Europe and part of Asia. Now, one of the things that Tim Marshall argues in his book is about the kind of cartographic anxiety that a country like Russia faces. So I'm going to read you this small extract from Prisoners of Geography. Vladimir Putin, Marshall says that he is a religious man, a great supporter of the Russian Orthodox Church. If so, he may well go to bed each night, say his prayers and ask God, why didn't you put some mountains in Ukraine? If God had built mountains in Ukraine, then the great expanse of flat land that is the North European plain would not be such an encouraging territory from which to attack Russia repeatedly. As it is, Putin has no choice. He must at least attempt to control the flatlands to the west. So it is with all nations, big or small. The landscape imprisons their leaders, giving them fewer choices and less room to maneuver than you might think. So if I remove the text again, the area that Marshall is talking about is in the area occupied by the Ukraine to the northwest of the Black Sea. And his argument here is that if there had only been mountains there, if God had only bequeathed Russia mountains, it would be less anxious about its western flank. Russia wouldn't need to look westwards for border security. Marshall goes on to explain that Russia is otherwise surrounded by, for example, a frozen ocean in the north, mountains to the south, and this border between Russia and Europe is the source of so much anxiety and geopolitical strategy that Russia enacts and indeed obsesses about. The land on which we live has always shaped us, Marshall says. It has shaped the wars, the power, the politics, and social development of the people that now inhabit nearly every part of the earth. Overall, there is no one geographical factor that is more important than any other, he says. Mountains are no more important than deserts, nor rivers than jungles. In different parts of the planet, different geographical features are among the dominant factors in determining what people can and cannot do. So I think you're beginning, I hope, to get a sense of how Marshall thinks about geopolitics. What he's interested in here is the relationship between the physical geography of place and the culture, the identity, the strategic imperatives of particular political units. Now, what we call this, if you take this to its extreme, this is something called geographical determinism or environmental determinism. In other words, people and places are shaped purely if we take it to its natural extent, purely by the geographical conditions and the topographical conditions that country experiences. Now, that is undoubtedly one kind of geopolitics. And I want to try and explore that with you today, and also to show that there are other ways of thinking geopolitically in the world as well. Now, Tim Marshall's particular thesis of the world, the way he thinks about the world, is clearly exceptionally popular. Again, I know this because many of you have been inspired by Marshall to get involved and to take political geography and geopolitics on in your studies at university. You can judge this by the number of sales of his book as well, sales that, frankly, I look at with a great deal of envy. He sold 1 million copies, perhaps more by now, of Prisoners of Geography. He has been on the Sunday Times bestseller list. He's on the New York Times bestseller list as well. So Marshall's kind of geopolitics is very popular. And I think this review in the New York Times is really interesting. Marshall's insistence on seeing the world through the lens of geography compels a fresh way of looking at maps, not just as objects for orientation or works of art, but as guideposts to the often thorny relations between nations. And I think the review is absolutely right. It does absolutely guide us towards the thorny relations between nations. He's very gifted at doing that. I do have one point of contention with this review, and that is, I just wonder how fresh this is. So in the slides that are going to follow, what I want to try and do is to show you that there's actually a history to Marshall's particular approach to geopolitics. There's a history to the kind of relationship between place, people, and power that Marshall is exploring. In other words, there's a history to geopolitics. Now, writing from 2021, we need to go back way more than a century in order to try and discover the origins of geopolitics. I'm rolling back the clock here, and we're going to land on the year 1899. And 1899 is the year where geopolitics as a word gets used for the first time. But before I tell you about that moment, I want to come forward slightly in time. I want to push back to 1904. Because I think in 1904, we can trace a particular British story related to geopolitics. And that British story starts with this map. Some of you may have seen this map before. For others, this may be your first time seeing it. Some of you may think, what a strange map that seems to be. These are names, these are terms that I don't recognize. Well, before we dive into that map, I want to tell you a little bit about where it comes from and who its author was. Its author was a man called Halford Mackinder. Some of you again may know Mackinder's name. Mackinder was a British, an English geographer, an academic, a politician, and a diplomat. He was alive between 1861 and 1947, and he had an illustrious academic and diplomatic career. He was the co-founder of the London School of Economics in 1895. He'd go on and then become the director of the LSE some years later. Perhaps of more relevance to today's lecture, in 1893, he was the co-founder of the Geographical Association, who have kindly invited me to speak to you today. So he was involved in the foundation of this very institution. Because he was very interested in education, he went on to hold a number of significant positions in the GA later in his life. Now, what Mackinder was really interested in was developing and fostering a new kind of geography. He basically considered that the kind of geography that was being taught in schools and universities at the turn of the 19th into 20th centuries was completely inadequate for preparing the next generation of British imperial subjects. Mackinder was ultimately concerned that the British Empire was facing an international and perpetual decline, and that the next generation of Britons were not adequately prepared to be the imperial subjects that he wanted them to be and that the empire required them to be. So here we are. Here we have a man who's absolutely embroiled in the politics of empire. And he was very critical of geography as a subject. He considered it a subject that had become obsessed with studying past glories and past discoveries, but was no longer, or wasn't, the active, forward-looking, evangelical subject, particularly not a subject that was in the service of empire that he thought it could be. So what he proposed was a new geography. And this was going to be a new imperial geographical science that would replace the study of the classics, and that would become the foundational and fundamental basis for a British imperial education. He thought that by studying geography in the way that Mackinder envisaged, could produce the next generation of statesmen and military strategists who could push the British Empire forward at that particular moment. Geography, Mackinder said, rightly understood, is a matter of imagination, and its function in education is to extend and make precise and flexible the imagination. So he was really interested in geography as a way of thinking, as a way of being able to envisage the world and its conditions. He said that in 1904. In 1902, he also helps us out by offering this further delineation. To visualize is the very essence of geographical power, which should be cultivated until it becomes possible to think of the whole world surface at once in all its complexities, with its girdles of all kinds, telegraphic, railway, steamer, girdles of power, girdles of thought. For every touch of the helm of government, either at Westminster or in the city, produces a ripple which goes right around the world, like a wave in the air emitted from Krakatoa, meeting obstacles and producing varied results. Nothing happens without producing results in every part. So Mackinder's kind of geography was a global geography, seeing the world as globally interconnected, with actions in one place affecting what was happening somewhere else. And the place where he thought action was going to happen, as you can see here, was at the very center of the imperial metropole. In Westminster, the political heart of the empire, or in the city, the economic, the financial heart of the empire. And you can see here his thinking that if things happen in that center, then there would be effects, rebounding effects all around the world. Just like Krakatoa, of course, that famous volcano that erupted in the Far East, Indonesia, Java, with the global consequences of that being felt in subsequent months and years. So Mackinder's geography was a global geography that involved the power of the imagination to see the world as a whole. And if you had a failure of imagination, then Mackinder's geography would also help you out, because it was also a kind of geography that rebounded into the classroom with new school textbooks, with a rewriting of the national curriculum. Mackinder rewrote the curriculum that we were still studying right up until comparatively recently. And if you were a school child in the early part of the 20th century, all you needed to do was to look on the wall and you would see the empire, that global vision mapped out behind you on a wall, such as here in the Cuthbertson School in Glasgow, which was just outside the constituency that Halford Mackinder would ultimately become the MP for. So just to go into a little bit more detail about Mackinder's global outlook, his thinking was a little bit like Tim Marshall's, is that the natural environment shapes culture and national identity. But he also thought that states, rather like organisms, rather like human bodies or viruses or whatever it may be, are locked naturally and inevitably in a state of competition with other states for food and resources. And you can see in that kind of belief some Darwinian kind of thinking. He thought that international relations were animated through force and a desire for territorial expansion, but he also set Britain apart from some of those instincts by saying that Britain, rather contrarily, was driven by a liberal internationalist desire to spread freedom and democracy. So while other countries were animated through force, Britain had these higher kinds of ambitions. Such was Mackinder's British imperial exceptionalism. And that takes us ultimately back to the map that I started off this section with. Now, this map was presented in a paper to the Royal Geographical Society in 1904. It's called The Geographical Pivot of History, and it really allows us to see visually Mackinder's geographical and geopolitical imagination at work. In the center of this map, you see this area called the pivot area, and around it, you see this crescent of other spaces. And ultimately, what Mackinder's thesis was at this particular time suggested that the pivot area of the world was, in a sense, the most geopolitically significant area. Who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. And for Mackinder, the world island was Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, that massive continental conjoined landmass. Who rules the world island commands the world. So what Mackinder was arguing here was that if you could control the pivot area of history, then you could dominate the world and become the world's most important political power. And that idea resonated around the world because it sounded like a call to arms. It sounded like a geopolitical strategy that if you could dominate that space, then you could dominate the world. So I'm going to leave that there and come back to that in a second. So as you know, I came forward to 1904, but we really need to go back to 1899 to see the origins of the word geopolitics. And this is where I want to do a little bit of genealogy, because the word geopolitics and the concept has many different parents. Perhaps I should say many different fathers, because sadly, we are mostly talking about men here. And what I want to do is I want to turn initially to Sweden and to Rudolf Kjellén here, who was alive between 1862 and 1922. He was a professor of political sciences. Like Mackinder, he was also a politician as well as being an academic. And he coined the term geopolitics in 1899. Now, Kjellén was both a really prominent European scholar, but he was also a student. He'd been a student of a German imperial political scientist called Friedrich Ratzel, who you can see here on the right-hand side. And the flag, in case you're wondering, is the German imperial flag. So Kjellén was both a student of, but also worked closely with Ratzel. And here in Ratzel, we have a really significant figure, professor of geopolitics, of geography at Leipzig University, often considered to be the father of political geography. And he was an avowed supporter of the German Empire. And these two men influenced each other's careers. I'm just going to focus a little bit on Ratzel for a second, just to focus in on some of his important geographical theories. So here we're getting an insight into his geopolitical imagination. Some ideas that he played with during his lifetime. First of all, the idea of Lebensraum. This is an idea that territory, that a particular country requires a particular territory to sustain and support people. But more than that, that strong Kultur, as he would say, would naturally expand. So strong states, strong people, however we wish to define strong, would expand to occupy the space occupied by weaker cultures, weaker people. And that would just happen naturally. He wasn't advocating for it. He was just observing something that he considered to be an observable practice in the world. Now that is combined with this idea of the organic theory. And rather like Mackinder, he was absolutely an advocate of this idea that states are like organisms. They require space and resources to survive and grow, and picking up on those Darwinian ideas that successful organisms would win out. There was a survival of the fittest kind of mentality here. Now, these weren't necessarily designed to be aggressive strategies. What he considered these to be was just observations about the way the world was. So those were some of the key strategies or key ideas that Ratzel was playing with at the time. So let's bring these two men back in, and let's add in people like Mackinder. Let's add in also people like Alfred Mahan, the American geostrategist, who was really interested in the sea and sea power as the place to kind of dominate the world. And the collective thinking of these men influenced another generation of geopolitical scholars and geopolitical ideas. And in order to see the source of that next generation, we have to look to somebody called Karl Haushofer, who was another German imperial geopolitical scientist. And his particular Geopolitik in German was the duty to safeguard the right to the soil, to the land in the wider sense, not only the land within the frontiers of the Reich, but also to the right to the more extensive Volk and cultural lands. So what Haushofer here was building on these ideas of the heartland and of the organic state theory and of Lebensraum, and was beginning to kind of metastasize these into something more toxic. He took Lebensraum. He considered that small states should and would inevitably be consumed or subsumed into bigger states. He took on that idea of the organic theory where only the stronger state would survive. He absolutely embraced Mackinder's heartland idea. And by doing that, he oriented Germany's expanding geopolitical and sharpening geopolitical attention towards Eastern Europe. So those were, again, some of his ideas. Now, if we take Haushofer and we remember the time that he was working, then we also need to recognize that Haushofer's ideas got adapted and adopted by other geopolitical forces. So that photograph I showed you before, if we expand that out, then you can see that he's standing next to somebody called Rudolf Hess. Now, Rudolf Hess may be somebody that you are already familiar with if you're students of history. This is how Rudolf Hess might otherwise be seen in your history textbook, standing beside as Deputy Führer alongside Adolf Hitler. So whether Haushofer intended it or not, whether he liked it or not, his ideas of the organic state, of Lebensraum, of the heartland that he'd borrowed from Mackinder, became adopted by Nazi ideology in the 1920s and 1930s. And you can see that in books like Mein Kampf, for example, where Hitler's understanding of Lebensraum begins to emerge. And you can see it also here in these propaganda posters from the 1930s. Lebensraum as an international endeavor that would involve a new round of colonization, but also as a continental endeavor pushing east towards the pivot area of history, towards the heartland. Now, the connection between Haushofer and the Nazi Party has been contested and disputed. But what I want to do now is just to show you a quick bit of video that was from an American propaganda movie that really attempts to link Haushofer with this Nazi era ideology.
Out of the wilds of Mongolia came a mighty army of fierce horsemen, led by Genghis Khan. Burning, looting, pillaging, the barbarian horde swept across Asia and Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan conquered most of the world of the 13th century. Adolf Hitler was determined to outdo him and conquer all of the world of the 20th. Set up at Munich was an institute devoted to the little-known science of geopolitics, vaguely defined as the military control of space. Germany's leading geopolitician, a former general, Karl Haushofer, was head man. Here was gathered together more information about your hometown than you yourself know. To the German geopolitician, the world is not made up of men and women and children who live and love and dream of better things. It is made up of only two elements, labor and raw materials. The geopolitician's job was to transform Hitler's ambition to control these elements into cold, hard reality. On their map, our planet is neatly divided into land and water. Water forms 3/4 of the Earth's surface, land only 1/4. And in that 1/4 of the Earth's surface lies the world's wealth, all its natural resources. And the world's manpower. Control the land and you control the world. That was Hitler's theory. This all-important land, the geopoliticians now break up into 2 areas. One, the Western Hemisphere, which, together with Australia and all the islands of the world, including Japan, comprises 1/3 of the land area. The other area, which consists of Europe, Asia, and Africa, makes up the other 2/3. This supercontinent, which they call the World Island, is not only twice as large as the rest of the land area, but also includes 7/8 of the world's population. The heart of this world island comprises Eastern Europe and most of Asia. This they call the Heartland, which just about coincides with the old empire of Genghis Khan. Hitler's step-by-step plan for world conquest can be summarized this way. Conquer Eastern Europe, and you dominate the Heartland. Conquer the Heartland, and you dominate the world island. Conquer the world island, and you dominate the world. That was it.
Okay, so sorry that video was so long, but I think it's a fascinating bit of video. So you can clearly see in this American propaganda film an attempt to directly associate Karl Haushofer's ideas with Nazi party strategy. And in fact, what this video, it's so convincing that you actually might think that the Nazis really did have this incredible geopolitical strategy and this institution working for them. There are some elements of truth in that. But of course, this is American propaganda. And what they really wanted to do was to try and terrify the American population into continuing the war effort. And so, in fact, they rather overplayed I think the role of Haushofer and of geopolitics at the time. But and in some senses, it was so successful that it completely toxified geopolitics as a term long into the future. In fact, after the Second World War, geopolitics had become such a poisoned term that the geographer Richard Hartshorne talked about an intellectual poison. In perhaps no other branch of geography has an attempt to teach others gone so far ahead of the pursuit of learning by the teachers, he said. No self-respecting geographer or intellectual or academic would touch the term geopolitics for a very long time. And this was bound up in a real concern about geography as a subject as well, particularly in American universities, where Harvard University famously scrapped its geography program in the years after the Second World War. And geography itself seemed to be experiencing something of a crisis at that particular moment. But nonetheless, think about today. As I've already said, geopolitics today is everywhere. So what happened between that moment after the end of the Second World War and today that recuperated geopolitics' reputation? Well, I think we can look to 2 particular moments. First of all, in terms of political and military strategy, we need to look to that moment in the 1960s and 1970s, where Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor in the United States, and then he went on to become Secretary of State, absolutely embraced the idea of geopolitics and brought it right back into the center of American geostrategic thinking during the Cold War. You can see Henry Kissinger there pointing to that map, surrounded by other American officials. And Kissinger's thinking shaped and formed the way that the United States acted during that particular moment in the Cold War. Of course, bitter enemies with the Soviet Union, but also looking to build relationships with countries like China, but concerns about Southeast Asia, for example. So geopolitical thinking gets brought back, it's made acceptable again by Kissinger in the American administration. In terms of academic recuperation or resurgence, it was somewhat later. We have to look to a moment in the 1990s and 2000s when geopolitics becomes an active academic pursuit again. But it's not the geopolitics of old. It's a different kind of way of thinking geopolitically. So people like Gerard Toll and Joe Sharp, who you can see here on the right-hand side, are at the forefront of a movement called critical geopolitics. So this isn't about thinking about military strategy or attempting to map the world in terms of its resources in order to accumulate power. What Toll says here in 2012 is he would use the term critical geopolitics to describe any work that challenges the prevailing geopolitical assumptions and practices of the major powers. So this isn't a geopolitics in the service of the state or in the service of empires or in the service of major powers. It's about critiquing and unpacking the kind of assumptions that those major powers make about the world. In other words, it's a geopolitical lens through which we can interrogate the kinds of claims made about the world by those who would seek to narrate it. So why does all of this matter? Why is it interesting to think geopolitically? And why is it useful to know this backstory? Well, it's interesting and it's important because only by knowing that backstory, only by knowing where geopolitics comes from, can we fully understand the geometries of power that have existed in the past. And why, for example, during the Cold War, there was such a concern about the Soviet Union occupying the pivot area of history, and therefore also the need for things like security pacts and the need to work collectively. Here you've got the NATO alliance in blue, and you've got the Warsaw Pact countries in red. A similar kind of polar vision of the world that Mackinder also used in his map, making associations between place. And perhaps by thinking about the past and where some of these visualizations come from, can we understand why there was a certain rationality to NATO during the Cold War. But we also benefit because we can begin to see some of the underpinning strategy that continues to drive modern day geopolitics. So when China was developing its Belt and Road Initiative, well, one of the things we absolutely do know is that Mackinder has been translated into Mandarin and into Cantonese, and those ideas resonate through Beijing. So when we look at a map of the Belt and Road, China's trade superhighway, as it's termed on this map, with all of those maritime and overland links, perhaps in that we can begin to see resonances of the kind of visualization of the world that Mackinder was providing us with in 1904, and that American propaganda movie was offering us in the 1940s. Occupying and uniting this area in Central Asia, a return to the heartland, as I've termed it there, but also with territorial and maritime claiming going alongside that. And it's really important that we understand the history and evolution of some of the strategy and thinking that goes into these modern day geometries of power. But it also perhaps reveals to us certain kinds of futures as well, because geopolitics is extremely intoxicating. It's tempting, it's alluring. It seems to provide these really simple, intriguing answers to very complex questions. So when Britain, for example, talks about being global Britain again, why might it be doing that? Why might it have those global aspirations? Why might it be looking to the sea as a source of power? Why might it be considering sending its so-called Great Grey Fleet around the world in order to apparently mean business? Well, again, perhaps we can trace some of that back to geopolitical thinking of a century ago, when sea power and territorial power were locked in this kind of state of rhetorical competition. So what I want to suggest to you too is that it matters because by thinking about the idea of critical geopolitics, we can also begin to see the world in slightly more nuanced kinds of ways. So I don't want to necessarily encourage you to think about the world in terms of people and resources as units of labor. I want to draw your attention to the fact that critical geopolitics opens up really interesting questions about the way that we might look at the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that it scale jumped from the United States and has now become a global phenomenon. Or indeed the way that our attention is being drawn back to borders and questions of sovereignty in a globalizing world, perhaps issues of soft power and the extraordinary phenomenon that is K-pop, and the way that a country like South Korea has had this incredible ability to speak well beyond its own borders and to attract people to it rather than coerce people to take it seriously. Critical geopolitics also draws our attention to the non-human, to animals, and the representational logics that surround them. Here, the image of a kind of charismatic animal, that the polar bear here, struggling for survival in the Arctic, drawing our attention to major geopolitical issues like climate change. Also, mobilities, infrastructures, modes of transport, the globalized nature of our economy through sites like the Suez Canal. And of course, the recent blockage by the Evergreen of the Suez Canal. What does that tell us about the nature of the highly networked nature of the modern world? Well, critical geopolitics draws our attention to those spaces, to those materials, to those elements, and to those objects that are occupying the deck of that ship, shipping containers. Also, concepts of sovereignty, nationalism, and peacemaking and peacekeeping as well. Critical geopolitics, which builds on this long geopolitical history, draws our attention to all of these things. Geopolitics absolutely matters, but not always in the way that you might believe from particular popular texts. So with the 40-minute mark, more or less, there, I just want to conclude with a few points. So as a point I've made now several times, geopolitics is everywhere. It is animating the modern world. But what I want you to go away with knowing is that geopolitics is not one stable thing. It's a term that has changed very significantly over time, and it means very different things to very different people, whether those be military strategists, risk managers in banks and investment houses, think tanks, not think tanks, politicians, academics, and authors of popular texts. Every single one of these constituencies of people have a slightly different understanding of what geopolitics means. And you need to be attentive to that because it's very easy to see people talking at slightly different purposes. Geopolitics has undoubtedly evolved from and through a deeply contested and troublesome past. And it remains highly alluring and very powerful as a way of seeing the world. And that's largely thanks to its ability to provide often quite ready answers to highly complex questions. It is a way of interpreting patterns in the world, whether those interpretations are always accurate or right, and whether too much emphasis is placed on its ability to answer those questions is something that critical geopolitical scholars would undoubtedly question. And then ultimately, critical geopolitics helps us to ask those tough questions of the ways that some people seek to see the world, and absolutely is a way of challenging the geopolitical imaginations of particular elite actors. So I want to leave you with those final thoughts, and I welcome any questions that you may have. Aaron is back, and I think is going to coordinate questions for us. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alasdair. That was really, really interesting stuff. It was definitely interesting to learn a little bit more about the GA's founder, some stuff that I certainly didn't know beforehand. So I'm going to just give people a few more seconds to ask any questions if there are any. Obviously, if there aren't, then we'll just end the session there. For anybody that joined late, I'll just remind you again that that of course the full playback of this presentation will be available on the GA website, sorry, in the past events section, and you will also be able to get the PowerPoint there as well. So so feel free to go look at those at your leisure, and also to go back through some of the previous sessions that we've had, because we've had some really interesting ones over the last few months. I would also just encourage you to have a look at the rest of the GA website as well if you get a chance. There's quite a range now of GCSE and A-level web inquiries, teaching resources, and we are adding to those every single week. I know, because I have some to add later on this week myself. So do keep an eye on that as well. We do have one comment, just a comment, thanking you and praising you, Alasdair, for the session rather than a question.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Good. Oh, I didn't actually know that that Mackinder was necessarily part of the A-level curriculum. I'm sure he'd be delighted that his name was in the curriculum, given that he wrote virtually the first national curriculum of geography in the 1940s. So now he's being talked about himself.
Yeah, I think he will be very happy with that.
I think so.
Yeah, look, I don't think there are any more questions coming through today, so I think we'll just end it there, Alasdair. So thanks again for a really interesting talk, and thanks to everybody that joined us live, and to those of you that watch back later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.